Both of these guys have both practical experience on your side of the table, but now sit in sort of the catbird seat looking out at the industry, understanding what's working, what's not, and trying to share best practice with the industry. So what we wanted to do, both of them have done a lot of research specifically on the topic of impact. It's a topic that comes up every single day. So we wanted to find a way to share some of those insights with you. It's right after lunch. We didn't want to make it too formal, so no big presentations, but we wanted to just have a conversation. There's going to be 4 questions that I've prepared for these guys, but then at the end, we're going to save some time for you all to throw in your questions, so now's a good time to start thinking about that. If you don't have questions, we're just going to cold call on people. So we'll get right into it. But before we do that, just very quickly, I think most of you know we do a piece of research called How the Workforce Learns. The idea here is to look at learning from the perspective of individuals. And the reason that we do that is almost every conversation we have with customers, with potential customers, involves some version of the word culture. And I think if you're paying close attention to a lot of the conversations and a lot of the presentations today, it's a topic that is embedded in all of this, right? It's important to build a culture to get everybody to participate in learning, not just to receive learning. And so the definition of culture is literally shared values and behaviors. And so we wanted to look at that from the perspective of the employees. What are their behaviors? What are their values? That research was released at the beginning of this week. You all will be getting a copy of that in the post-event email. It's also in the pathway that'll be distributed on Degreed. And if you don't find it in either of those places, then feel free to track me down or your Degreed account executive. So we'll get right into it. What we did here is to just comb through a bunch of the Brandon Hall Group and Bersin research on impact and literally pull out a bunch of references to the word impact. And so I wanted to have a conversation between Michael and Julie, because I think there's a lot of common themes in their research, to get at these topics from a few different perspectives. So the first question is for Michael. This comes from your research. You guys said that for human capital management to have real business impact, we have to be able to predict the future using analytics to have the right talent at the right place at the right time. We heard this morning from Rita McGrath talking about how to start to see into the future a little bit. We have lots of questions about how do we figure out how to predict the future. So I'm curious, how are you seeing organizations actually doing this effectively?
Well, I think to clarify what we're trying to get at there, it's kind of a result of what the data said, because it said that 70% of organizations look retrospectively. So that was kind of the aha moment, is that if you're spending 70% of your time looking in the rearview mirror, you really can't keep your eye on the road. And with the speed of business, kind of keeping that analogy, business is moving so quickly. We know that if we look down at our phone, we could end up, in another country. How fast we're moving. So, in order the best way to describe the how is you have to kind of close in on 2 endpoints. One endpoint is, where do you want to end up? You have to spend a lot of time working with your stakeholders to say, what does the organization need to look like, and what are the talent objectives to make the organization look that way? Let's define a group of objectives. Some companies start with hardcore business objectives, some people start with something less, but the idea is you need something to shoot for, because if you're going to look into the future, you have to have a forward-looking approach and begin to stop looking so much in the rearview mirror. So one point is to create that, where do we want to be? The other piece is then, in order to be able to predict properly, you have to have a good foundation. And I always suggest that before there's analytics, there's data. And so what you want to do is begin to take steps to understand what data is immediately available to you within your organization and outside of your HR organization, because people just don't interact in an HR setting. They're out working, and sometimes they come to work late, and sometimes they're sick, and sometimes they leave, and sometimes they don't do the things that they're supposed to do, or sometimes they're asked to do new things. The activity around your people, capture all of that data and pull it together and begin to scrub it and figure out the quality of it. It's really important because everything that looks at the future, if you think about it, starts with the bias that you bring to the present. So for example, if you're trying to understand the connection between learning and performance and all you're doing is annual performance reviews, and you're trying to understand how learning is impacting every single day, you've got data, but it doesn't match. So you've got to begin to look at your data, understand the relationship, the interconnections between that data, and begin to scrub and create good quality data so that you can start to get firm decision making that everyone buys into, and also understand what new data sources you want to collect, and at the same time, how you're going to time all of that. And by just simply spending the time on the how of building a better front and a better back, then you begin to slowly but surely be able to look more forwardly rather than constantly looking at what happened behind.
Julie, this is something you guys are looking at too. Anything to add there?
There's a lot. I know we could talk all day. I think, first of all, I sympathize with the question because inside an organization, I think the thing that I wrestled with 1.5 years ago when I was still a practitioner is how do we make sure that people have the knowledge and the skills and the whatever to help us get the work done? And so to some extent though, and I agree with you that we spend far too much time looking backward, I think what I would add to that is we also need to make sure we understand the work that's going on right now. So in order to understand what we might need, getting clearer about the work itself, so not just the talent practices, not just who we might need to hire, but what is the work that they're actually doing? And yes, talent acquisition, particularly if we break the barriers down between the various areas of talent, if we can work together to look at, okay, what are they saying that we need to hire? Are we sure that we really need to hire that? Maybe we have that capability in-house. To me, this question around predicting the future often comes up in the context of skill prediction, which is why I think it's interesting where you guys are headed. But I think to some extent we have the issue of we can't even really predict the future without getting a better handle on the now.
Great segue. Michael, another piece of research that you guys have done that stood out to me included this snippet, right? Organizations with mature learning strategies, meaning those that are better aligned to business strategies, are 40% more likely to positively impact key business metrics. Mm-hmm. And to me, that speaks to vocabulary in terms of the metrics, speaking the same language as the operations. But I'm curious what this means to you guys.
Well, I think it's the story behind the story again, because I think that too much of the statistics, if they're looked at in the vacuum, means that A, we don't know what we're doing, or B, we don't know how to do it. And what that was really getting at was something much larger, which is 75% of the organizations that responded to that survey said that they believe their #1 objective is to link learning objectives to business objectives. But only 36% of companies were actually doing it. So we all have a sense of what we need to do. The problem is the execution. It's back to the how. And again, it's going to sound somewhat familiar to as the first answer, but you have to nail down the 2 endpoints. So if you want business metrics to drive and have a more mature learning model with that, you first have to understand what the business needs out of talent. That's going to be very clearly defined. Because back in the days of Clark and Willis and Marino and others that came up with outcome-based learning, that's what we have to do. Like when you're parenting, right, you don't start at the beginning. You think about the end and work backwards. You think about how you want your children to turn out, and then you work backwards into how you're going to get them there. And that's the same thing we have to do with outcome-based learning. We have to decide, how do we want our employees, our workforce, to be thinking and acting to meet those business objectives, and now what learning do I need to build in order to achieve that? And that's where the maturity comes, because the companies that were at level 3, level 4 maturity had 3 things in common. One is they had a very strongly aligned connection between their learning goals and their business goals. Secondly, to working with advanced technological companies like Deloitte, had a very well pronounced, very well defined, and very intricate learning technology ecosystem. And we're very advanced on using data and analytics to get into like what if and prediction. That was the commonality. It doesn't mean that companies that were at less of a maturity level had a bigger problem, but the idea being that if you focus on those 3 things, that's what brings that stronger connection between the two. So maturity is kind of sometimes it can be taken the wrong way. because we can continue to climb in how well we get at something. But that's what you're striving for, is first understanding what the business needs, what are the talent requirements, and then building learning to meet those behavioral and performance requirements for your talent.
Julie, everybody thinks they're doing this, or everybody, actually, I wish I didn't have lights blaring in my face, then I could see, because I'd ask the question in the audience, but most people think that they're doing this. What do you think they're getting wrong?
About linking skills to the business?
Yeah.
So I think one angle of it is, and now I'm going to sound like a broken record, Michael, is I think linking skills to business is really about making sure that we deeply understand the work. And that's beyond a sort of literal, I understand the strategy and I can articulate it. We talk about the value of empathy all the time in understanding our customers, right? Our employees are customers. So, and the people that we partner with in the business are our customers. So really cultivating some empathy around what are these folks actually doing? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? What's the value they're trying to create for customers? And then what role does the things that people do really create and connect to that? I guess the other angle I'd throw out there is, in thinking about and starting from the outcome, which I completely agree with, I think we also tend to sometimes think we have to provide every single bit of information for everyone to learn to perform every single task, and we will never keep up with that. So if we can think about some of the underlying human traits that help us be successful in a lot of different contexts, kind of like systems thinking or adaptive problem solving, then in the end, the reskilling part could get a little bit easier.
It's almost like you have a monitor in front of you telling you what to say to set up the next question.
Let me add, I just want to add one point, because I think what Julie's saying is spot on. You hear companies talk a lot about upskilling and reskilling. But a better way to think about it, based on what she is, think about an individual and say, why are they so good at that group of skills? Because there's an underlying competency connected to that. Think about what's the parent thing that's happening, and then it allows you to not necessarily think upskilling and reskilling, but saying, if they're already good at this, what are those competencies that they have that seem like would be very good to do this? It's like, you'd like to think that someone who mows the lawn could potentially trim your shrubs and plant flowers. And you could look at that as all skills and say, oh my goodness, it's one more skill that we have to teach them, to your point. But taking a step back and saying, what are the things that make them really good at the things that they already do? That's a competency.
Absolutely.
And leveraging that will make it a lot easier to develop your learning and development.
So my interpretation, when we talk about building a learning culture, it sounds a lot like that, right? It's not telling everybody what to do. It's creating a culture where people have a pretty good idea what they're supposed to be doing, and it's part of how people work. It's not something they do in addition to work. Julie, in your research on high-impact learning organizations, there was a line in here that traditional L&D practices, right, creating content, pushing content, blended learning, don't impact business outcomes. And that's most of how most of these people in the room spend most of their days, most of their money. We heard Julie this morning from Cargill talking about how she's trying to shake things up. But what your research also pointed out was the ingredients of a learning culture do consistently predict results. So the question for you is, what exactly are those ingredients? And what are some of the things that people could be doing to build a culture rather than to try and force it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the favorite ones I get asked. So we've been looking at what high-performing organizations have been doing for a long time, well before I joined Bersin 18 months ago, and over 4 different high-impact learning studies, a high-impact learning culture study, and then even if you look at some of our other HR research, there's some common threads around the extent to which we empower people, we encourage reflection, and we demonstrate the value of learning, not through this is how much we spend on training, but that, hey, this is a really cool and interesting thing to be doing by giving of our time and our talent at all levels. Those things consistently predict the ability of an organization to evolve and adapt over time. And we see that we just did an org design study, and the extent to which folks are empowered by understanding what decisions they make is one of the single strongest predictors of a company's maturity around organizational design. And if you think about it, on the surface, it's like, well, okay. But if you don't know what decisions you're allowed to make in your job, you probably don't make any decisions at all, and then nothing's gonna happen. So in order to empower people, you have to be clear about what are you actually allowed to decide? And then where do you need to maybe get someone else's perspective and ask for help? For learning, and what that means for learning, I think, is two things. One, it's, even though we love it, letting go of programs and curriculums and courses as a means to create change is a mindset shift that we have to make. And then it's also about, okay, the people who really can drive, whether someone knows what decisions they're allowed to make, whether we have the time to sit back and reflect at any point in a day. We as HR and learning people, we can help that, we can champion that, but in the end, it's the business leaders that really decide to do that or not decide it. So we can preach, they have to also decide, and we have to help them decide to pick it up, which is why influence is so, so important. In the end, I think the work of learning leaders is increasingly just of being a champion and being an influencer.
So I'm going to make a shameless plug. The closing keynote this afternoon, Mark Bonchek has a great set of advice that's packaged up into a really compelling presentation for the end of the day, so hopefully you all stick around for that. Michael, what does your research say about this stuff? I had lunch today with a very nice woman. I don't know if Amy, if you're here, say hi. She was telling me that she's going through exactly this, right? Trying to get people who come to her and her team as order takers to let go and to do things differently. How do you convince those people to go along with that shift that Julie just talked about?
I don't have an exact answer to that because it's a significant challenge.
Yeah.
It really is, to sit up here and say, you know, here's exactly what you need to do. I think what we suggest is to look at your culture and understand to what level these are tribal traditions and how much of it is more of a cultural issue than a learning and development or a talent. Or sometimes we have a tendency to say because it's a people thing, it's going to fall into one of our 25 processes when it's really just a big cultural thing. You've got to really decide how much do people need to reshape the way they think about work, how they delegate, how they prioritize, how the organization actually acts in a decision-making mode, and see that if whatever learning you come up with, is that going to be able to penetrate that culture? You know, an example of that is we'll say to companies, and I'm sure Julie recommends the same thing, is, you know, a good coaching and mentoring environment is what gives people more confidence to say, I don't have to ask you as much.
Absolutely.
And then everyone stops me right there and says, our managers are the worst coaches and mentors ever on the planet. You know, so what you're telling me now is I have to make every manager into a great coach and mentor before I can even solve 10% of this problem. And I just think that at some point in time, the HR organization is also going to have to hold hands, join forces with the CEO to say we're the cultural change agent. We have to make changes in the culture to make new ways of thinking and acting, you know, more receptive. And if that means changing out people or changing things, those are going to be the hard decisions that go back to the top leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One more question, then we're going to throw it out to you guys. So now's the time to start thinking about those questions. One more piece of research that grabbed me, Julie, from your research. And it's because you can't talk about impact without talking about metrics, even though everybody's sick about talking about metrics. Managers and executives don't spend time thinking about how many e-learning courses workers are taking. What matters to them are the things that matter to their business, things like customer satisfaction, delivery, sales, right? Results. One of the under sort of currents of the program is we're trying to subtly shift people's vocabulary. But these are the things that we need to be impacting through learning. So the question is basically, how do we make those metrics matter, right? What are some of the tips and tricks that you've seen from your work, either personally or in your work with clients?
Yeah, one of the things that we see in our high impact research, and I think it correlates with what you were talking about, Michael, is that organizations and I'm using organizations in the broadest sense, that focus on the performance of the organization and continuously monitor and sense how the organization is performing, are outperforming, to use the word performing again, organizations that are still focusing on measuring the metrics of activity. One of the hardest things to let go of, and I lived this as a practitioner because, like many of you, I used to put out dashboards, look at us, how many hours of learning are people doing, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, no one but us reads those, no one but us is interested. If we can, and if the business is performing, and the business sees, because they're involved, they're co-creating, like Julie was talking about this morning, then they know they know what's happening that's creating those outcomes. And they're not gonna ask you for hours and cost per learner. And I have this discussion a lot, I bet you do too. Well, don't we need to measure and track all those things for our own efficiency? You can. It may help you, but is that nearly as important as the stuff that actually drives top-line business growth and profitability? And if your partners see that you are focused on the right things, they're a lot less inclined to grill you on, well, what about this, and how expensive was this, and how long does it take, and all those types of things. I don't know why I'm talking to you.
But I'm enjoying it.
You know what? That's what I'm here for.
So here's the other part of it, is that, and it's probably something that we all are starting to realize but don't necessarily want to embrace, is the report card for learning is no longer in the learning organization. You know, you don't hold the report card anymore. So if you say that every single employee got 32 hours of training this year, we had 88s and 90s, everybody's passing, it's a big love fest on all of your internal metrics. The business is going to say those metrics don't matter because that doesn't connect to performance. So it's really nice you have all these feel-good measurements, but how does that relate to the business case ROI of learning and its impact on performance? So one of the things that I think we have to kind of embrace, Tahora, is that just like your kids are worried about their report card and they can't like change the grades before you sign it, your new report card is being held by your business stakeholders. They're going to decide, no matter how much time and effort you put into learning, they're going to decide whether or not it was effective. They're going to decide whether it was efficient, and they're going to use their business metrics to measure you. And the starkness of it is, if that doesn't happen, they're going to give learning an F. Despite all the effort that we put in as practitioners, they will. So what we've got to begin to do is we've got to get out there ahead of the curve, and we have to establish the metrics that matter to the organization. That's what I would add to the end of the question. How do we make metrics that matter to the organization? Not to learning, not to HR, not to even individuals, but to the organization. Because in the end, that's going to be the success or failure quotient for learning. And a lot of HR professionals today, and you know, being a former head of HR, like, it is not our favorite thing to do is to get out and talk to business stakeholders about what they need. Because you're either afraid, A, that you may not be able to deliver it, might not be able to deliver it in time, may not even understand what they're asking, may not even think it has anything to do with what you can affect or should even be doing. But we have to have that courage to get out there and at least understand it and work it back. Companies that formulate their individual development plans between HR, whoever's going to deliver the learning, and their manager are 60% more effective than organizations that don't, because one is really understanding the metrics that matter and shooting for that, and others is hoping that what you create and what you measure is going to matter.
Can I add one thing? Sorry,
sure,
I can't help myself.
People start sticking your hands up if you've got questions, please. People pay tens of thousands of dollars for their advice, and we're going to get it to you for free.
So what you just said, I think, is incredibly powerful, and I would add one more thing to it, which is the more time that you're out there talking with someone from the business about this. First of all, they don't expect us to know everything. They know we don't do their jobs. So asking the questions and demonstrating the curiosity is a good first step. And then before you know it, and folks that do co-creation will tell you this, it is no longer your problem.
Right.
It's our problem.
It's
See,
a
I'm talking
shared
to you
problem.
again. It's like I can't stop.
I feel bad for Todd. Do you
I
want
know.
to pull
Do
in?
you feel left out? Are you
No, I'm good. This is for everybody.
So I think then it becomes something where, and I was very blessed in some of my work as a practitioner to see this happen, to go from someone coming and yelling at me about everything that was wrong with the learning work we were doing, to a year later we had been working on something together, and his reaction was, well, gee, I guess this isn't work. What are we going to do? What are we going to do next? And he wasn't like the royal we, it was the actual we. So I think the other benefit of getting out there is that you're inviting the business to really be a part of solving the problem. And people like to solve problems. Honestly, they do.
I'm going to have to cut you guys off here. Here's Julie and Michael's email addresses. If anybody's got more questions, feel free to email them directly. They would love to talk to you. Do we have any questions in the audience? I can't see anything, so just grab the mic and start talking.
There's one here. Oh, and there's one over there.
The question I've got is about how do you measure success when learning is increasingly in the flow? So it becomes trickier in my mind.
In the flow. New term.
So, well, Michael couldn't hear the question, so just to be clear, the question is, how do you measure success when learning is increasingly in the flow?
I mean, I can take that. I think it's when you stop measuring learning and you're actually measuring the work. It's a crazy mindset. It's actually kind of hard to get your head around at first. It doesn't matter. We don't have to measure learning if people are performing. If we're measuring performance and the performance is happening, does it really matter? If they're getting the resources they need, they're telling you they're getting the resources that they need, and the business is successful, does it really matter? It's something to think about.
I would even take a step before that. If you kind of think about parenting, like the lead indicator to knowing whether you're being listened to or not is how they begin to behave differently. So the garbage is not going out every single day to the curb, but it's getting out there more than it used to, right? And we're going to say that that was successful. Before you get definitive performance change for learning, you're going to see people behaving differently. There's going to be new ways of thinking and acting. The best way to manage that is ask the learner, do they feel like this is different? Do they feel like they're building up a head of steam and doing this differently? Are they embracing their learning, feeling confident? And how do the managers feel about the change in behavior? Because you may be training someone on a very complex task or competency that to fast forward and say they got it, maybe months away, but it doesn't mean they're making all these incremental changes. And if you don't see it, I actually think learning in the flow of work can be added back to say what learning do we need to reinforce in a micro fashion to keep people on track.
Or to help people recognize that they are on that path. What I like about your questions is, and that idea is another way of instilling that reflection and helping people recognize, oh yeah, I am figuring this out, or I'm on the journey.
Yeah, give people credit for what they already know.
Right. I got to cut you guys off. So actually, right before the E fell down yesterday, Vidya said something along the lines of measuring progress is as important as measuring where people are at.
Right.
So thanks very much for sharing your time after lunch.